we got 3 of us up. I'm gonna kick the other 2 out because they needed to get on. I sent them where they can look. I sent them where they can look at it.
How are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, sir. Good to see you.
All right, so we're all good. I think we're good. We're live, Facebook Live. All well. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody who's viewing on Facebook Live. We'll be posting it later to YouTube at Vote Slowinski. So I want to welcome our 2 candidates who are with us. We're expecting at least 1 more, possibly. Actually, we're expecting 2 more. Alan Buckley and Annette Davis-Jackson said they'd be attending. I hadn't heard from anybody else. So I'd like to welcome our 2 other candidates here. We have, on the Republican side, we have Derrick Grayson. Say hi, Derrick. Unmute yourself, sir.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. And on the Democratic side, we have Richard Dean Winfield. Is that correct?
Yes.
Please say
Hi,
hi.
everyone.
So tonight, and I'm Brian Slowinski. I'm the Libertarian Party candidate for the Senate seat, as well as I've been recommended by the Constitution Party. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this 6th debate, Power to the People Squared. And the reason why I called it Power to the People Squared is we need to make sure that the people are hearing all voices. We need more choices and all voices when it comes to voting in November. So we're here to give you not the 30-second soundbite or the canned answer that's given by a focus group. We're here to actually talk to you as candidates what we feel about certain subjects and to give you more than a 30-second or a 1-minute soundbite. So in that regard, our subject for tonight is national debt, student debt, and the deficit. So in starting with that, let's go opposite this time. We're going to go from last time we went from bottom to top. Now we're going to go from top to bottom. Mr. Grayson, can you first give us 5 minutes on anything you want on the national debt, student debt, and the deficit? Sir, go right ahead.
Oh, okay, on national debt.
Yes, sir.
And the who? National debt and
National debt, student debt, and our deficit.
Student debt and our deficit.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I do believe we look at our national debt and deficit spending a little differently. But what I will say about spending and debt is this. Most people do not understand our monetary system. So oftentimes I don't delve into that or from that they use to spend on various programs. Well, 2 ways primarily. They get it through taxation.
Hey, Derrick. Derrick.
Yeah,
We lost you for a minute. So can you start over just start over because literally we lost our connection. So just start over.
I think your collection got lost. I could still see Mr.
You could.
Winfield.
Okay.
I could hear you throughout.
Oh, okay, then keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I hate for him to have to hear me go through all that again.
Okay.
So most don't understand. When I was in school, even down to fractional reserves and whatnot. But I'm going to try and make a long story short. The government has no money of its own. All of the money that they have, they get from basically two places. The Federal Reserve, which is not a federal entity, that is a name slapped on it to give the illusion that it is part of the federal government, but they are a private bank that lends money to the federal government, in which they loan out to banks, which they spend on programs, and then in turn charge the American people interest on that debt, so that we and our children are responsible for repaying that money along. Understanding that, we now have a government that is wholly engaged in borrow, tax, and spend. Oh, and I've left out the second place where they get their money is through taxation. Federal income tax is one of the primary areas that the federal government takes money from us by force. So when they borrow this money, and listeners, they then spend it. However, when the next year rolls around, what we have seen is they decide they want to spend more money. So they borrow more money. So each year, they don't stick with the budget that they had the previous year, because they always want more money to spend on more things, or greater amounts of money on those things, which increases the amount of money that they borrow each and every year. You've all heard of continuing resolutions. And those continuing resolutions extends the amount of debt that they can put on the backs of the people, at which point they go borrow that money and they start the spending all over again. What people don't understand is when you operate in a system that has to continuously borrow money to spend on more things, you will never balance the budget, and the debt will never be decreased. And that is the one thing for the life of me that I can't even understand why politicians don't understand. Now that's what people tell me, well, they're a freshman Congress. Well, they don't get it yet. Well, all they got to do is read the Constitution, Brian, and they will get it. All they got to do is understand how to balance a checkbook, or all they've got to do is understand how they deal with their own credit cards and the banks that increase their credit limit. But anyway, I digress. The bottom line and the problem, Brian, is until we get rid of our monetary system, nothing else matters. This is going to implode. It's not a matter of if, it is simply a matter of when. The Federal Reserve needs to be abolished, and the monetary system that we operate on needs to be replaced with a sound monetary system that is owned by the people, that incurs no interest. As far as student loan debts go, we have done our students a disservice with the advent of Jimmy Carter's 1979 Department of Education. We screwed all of our children. They get these student loans, these debts, backed by the government, of which the government can't pay back, because every student that defaults on student loan debt, the American people are the ones picking up that tab. Why? Because the federal government has no money of its own. So when people like Bernie Sanders say, we're going to eliminate all student loan debt, what they're saying is, American people, whether you went to college or not, and even if you paid for your college education yourself, these people that went and got these loans, to hell with it. We're going to forgive that debt, borrow the money from the Fed, pay the banks, who are the bigger winners in this, or your children are going be stuck with paying that debt back. So that's actually the system that we live under.
Showing the rest, and somehow I linked in I'm not linking into the meeting for some reason.
Well, we can hear you. We can hear you. Right?
I punched try to join as a guest. Isn't that what you're supposed to press?
No, you should have a link that lets you in as a member, not a guest. And I believe that is the reason why your camera is disabled.
Yeah, we're hearing you right now.
Well, all right. So what's the status? We giving what 2-minute job?
5 minutes on the national debt, the deficit,
right,
and student debt.
Tell me when it's,
What?
Tell me when it's my turn.
Why don't you go ahead right now, Alan? You go ahead, Alan.
Can somebody else go before me so I can still try to get in this thing?
Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Let me go last. I'm going to try
Okay.
to do it anyway. Yeah.
Richard, do you want to go while I try to figure this out?
Okay. Sure.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Hi. My name is Richard DeanWinfield. I'm running as a Democrat in this special election. I've been living in Athens, Georgia since 1982, teaching philosophy at the university. I am also a member of the Communication Workers of America, Local 3265, which is trying to organize all the employees of the state university system. And I ran 2 years ago for, I'm running this time around for the Senate in order to bring to the Senate the policies that I think have been ignored by the political establishment in both the Republican and Democratic parties, who have really neglected the measures that would enable our government to serve as a true guardian of our freedom and fulfill the social rights that we need in order to have economic independence, take care of our families, even the playing field between employer and employee, balance work and family, have access to decent housing, have access to education at all levels, have access to legal counsel in both civil and criminal cases, and in that way to really be able to get rid of all the obstacles to opportunity that have made the American dream an unfulfilled quest for most Americans, and have left both racial and gender disadvantage entrenched and left us really defenseless against the threats of pandemics and the advancing climate change. And I also think the threat of nuclear proliferation and the possibility of nuclear war. But one thing we have to deal with is to understand the way in which our national debt functions and the role of debt as it afflicts all too many Americans, because it turns out that a large part of the American population, in fact 70%, have barely more than $700 on hand to meet any emergency. Many people, although they have an income, are essentially broke because their debts are equal to whatever income and savings they have. And I think it's important to recognize that the finances of a state are different from the finances of a household. They're also different from the finances of a city and the finances of a state government, in the sense of a province, as other countries would call what we call states. A household, you're very limited in terms of what kind of wealth you have at your disposal. You depend upon your income, you have certain assets, and if you can try to borrow money, which will be dependent dependent upon the kind of credit rating you have, which in some respect will reflect both your income, your prospects to maintain your job, and whatever assets you have. States and municipalities are also very limited in terms of their finances. They can try to issue bonds, but they're not necessarily going to be taking buyers from around the world because the state finance, maybe a province's finance, is limited, and it's very possible for a state to not be able to pay its arrears. The federal government is in a different situation, and it's in a different situation because in a country like ourselves, it has a sovereign currency. It has a currency that is issued by the state, issued indeed through an independent government agency. I don't think it's really a private agency, but a government agency, the Federal Reserve and our Treasury. And we have a currency that is instituted in a way that gives us maximum fiscal flexibility. Namely, it is not pegged to any particular commodity like gold or silver. It's also not pegged to any foreign currency. And as a result, the value of the dollar no longer depends upon how much gold we have in Fort Knox or silver. It doesn't depend upon how much currency in any other national currency we have. It really is going to depend upon, in some respect, the ability of our nation to tax, the ability of our nation to sell bonds to other nations, and also the ability for us to issue currency that will be used in a way to fund economic expansion. Because as long as our economy grows, that is going to ultimately give us not only a reasonable balance between goods and services and currency, which will undercut the threat of massive deflation, and it will also give us eventually the ability to increase taxes and also to have a kind of credit worthiness as far as the world is concerned, to be able to finance the public investments that are necessary. I'll discuss some of these things later. I see my time is coming up.
All right, well, thank you, Richard.
I guess I'll pass the baton either to Alan or...
Yeah, we'll go to Alan since we're Alan, unmute yourself. And why don't you go ahead, 5 minutes on the national debt, the deficit, and if anything you want to mention about...
I see you, Alan, by the way.
Yes, we can see you.
Made it.
Unmute yourself, Alan. Alan, you unmute yourself? Can't hear you. Unmute yourself. Don't hear you. Can't hear you right now, Alan. Okay, why don't you try? Okay, why don't we instead go to John? John Fortuin, can you go ahead? Go ahead, John.
Hi, Brian. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I hear you. I don't see you.
Oh.
I can see you.
Okay. Anyhow, hello, Georgia. My name's John Green Fortune. I'm running against America's rigged systems, running against our rigged healthcare system, running against an economy rigged for the 1%, and running for universal basic income, UBI. UBI to save our economy for the people and not the 1%. I'm running against a rigged justice system that is really an injustice system, a system that criminalizes Black lives, people of color, and poverty. I'm running to ensure my multiracial family can enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm running for social justice, nonviolence, grassroots democracy, and ecological wisdom, the 4 pillars of the Green Party. And I'm the nominee of the Green Party in Georgia for the seat. And I'm running to take power back to the American people and take the power away from the 1%, as they have shown contempt for our lives, our families, and our future. How many minutes do I have?
You have 5 minutes, sir.
5 minutes.
You have 4 four and a half. You have 3.5 minutes left, sir.
Okay, great. I'm running against America's rigged healthcare system, running against a rigged private insurance system, running against a system that delivers coronavirus for all, and running for Medicare for all, implemented now, regardless of the contempt of the two major parties for the needs, the health needs of the American people. I want to address some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. The national debt. I recall the national debt being brought up as a major campaign issue when, in 1980, when candidate Reagan was running against President Carter. They hammered away on the danger of the deficits that were being run up under the Carter administration, which were modest. And once Reagan took power, he ballooned the deficit up, I believe, at least 50%. Other Republicans have run on as deficit hawks, and once again saddled the American people with deficits by cutting taxes for those who don't need a tax cut, who should be paying their fares in a regulated bank. Never were about fair. There was always about grab everything you can and screw the rest. That's really what the elites have been promoting. And while I'm focusing at this point on the Republican, when candidate Clinton ran with his ideas that have since come to be termed neoliberal ideas, really ideas borrowed from the Republican Party, so they could cash in on the campaign donations from the giant corporations that Republicans were cashing in on. Yeah, Clinton then delivered Republican dreams in form of legislation that deregulated a whole number of industries and saddled students with debt unnecessarily. If there's anything the economy, our government should invest in, it's in our students. And Clinton destroyed a weak but semi-effective student grant system that should have been left intact, and fulfilled the dreams of bankers. And I'm going to want to discuss, as we get into it, how really deficits, because the Congress has the power to control its own currency because we're a sovereign nation. And my name is John Fortuin, and thank you.
All right, thank you, John. Alan, can you hear us yet? Can you hear us? I can't hear you, John.
Yes.
John, I can hear you. Can you hear us? You hear me now?
You didn't hear my speech?
Yes, I heard you, John. Sorry, I'm trying to get at
Oh,
Alan.
okay.
Try to mute yourself if you can.
Okay.
Alan, can you hear us? Alan, can't hear you? I got no sound from you, Alan. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties tonight. Try to reboot your thing, and we'll come back to you, Alan. All right, you guys hear me? Derrick and John and Richard hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go ahead, and hopefully Alan can come back in. Again, my name is Brian Slowinski. I'm the Libertarian Party candidate. I've been endorsed for the United States Senate in the special election. I've also been recommended by the Constitution Party of Georgia. I'm here to talk about the national debt, our deficit, and also student debt. Number one issue facing us right now is our national debt and the deficit that we have. We cannot continue down this same road again, because if we do, this road we're on is a dead end. As Derrick Grayson said, and I agree with him, it all comes down to our money supply and the Federal Reserve. The best way that we as a country can get out of this is to change our money supply and get away from the fiat money that we currently have. This fiat money is killing this country. Since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was enacted, the Federal Reserve Act was enacted, the dollar has bought less and less and less through inflation. And by doing that, we've made it more and more difficult for families in order to make ends meet. That's one of the reasons why you see families having to have 2 jobs or 2 income earners in the family, because the dollar doesn't buy what it used to buy anymore. We need to get away from this fiat money system, because right now, the way the Federal Reserve is set up, the only way money gets put into circulation, it gets put in as a debt. And the debt never gets extinguished. The only way it can get extinguished is by people going bankrupt. That's the reason why we have all these ups and downs and cycles that we have, whether it be like in 2008 with the financial crisis then, or home mortgages or anything like that. We're going to continue to have these ups and downs unless we change back to a monetary system like this country was originally found on, that is a wealth-based system. Now, we don't have enough gold and silver to do that. So my suggestion is that we do something that all the American people benefit from. One of the things that we all benefit from, and it's also in the enumerated powers, is we're supposed to be able, the federal government is supposed to be able to build post roads. So what I am suggesting is that we base our monetary system on building better roads and bridges and infrastructure. By doing that, the money is spent in. So, like for example, if you're going to build a bridge, let's say you spend $10 million on that bridge, okay, to build that bridge, and you have to pay somebody. Well, you pay them with the wealth-based money, and they use that instead of the fiat-based money, and the money is not brought into the system as a debt, so it doesn't put additional debt on our society or on the American people. Instead, what it does is it builds and builds and builds, because that dollar is going to turn over and over again, because the construction workers are going to get paid. They're going to eat in the local areas where they're building the bridge. They're going to have a place to stay in the hotels, and that money will turn over and over and over again. Obviously, they're going to need to eat as well. So by strengthening our roads and bridges, which everybody benefits from, and our infrastructure, I would also include with that broadband. I think that is part of the internet superhighway that will help when it comes to education throughout the country. It's very sad that we don't have broadband all over the country. It's just because it's a political decision, not because it's the right thing to do. And that's something we need to do, is we need to address our national debt by changing our monetary system. And also we need to bring down our spending and provide for less government. That's why I'm in favor of getting rid of a lot of government programs that are not constitutional. I would work on eliminating the Department of Education. First off, education needs to be taken care of on the local and state level, not on the federal level. That's one of the ways I would do it. I would cut other departments as well. Department of Transportation, the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy. We need to look at where we can eliminate departments that don't belong on the federal level. They need to belong on the state or the local level. And that's what we need to do. We also need to eliminate all the ABC programs that shouldn't be on the federal level. They need to be actually on the state and local level. That's what my campaign is about, actually giving a voice to the people. And when it comes to student debt, the students have been sold a bill of goods since the Department of Education was instituted under Jimmy Carter. It's sad, but we need to come to some resolution. I don't know what resolution is, but I'm willing to listen to different things. But obviously, we need to get students get jobs. And one of the things I like about changing from the Federal Reserve System is by doing that, there will be jobs all over the place, and it'll create more jobs with a different monetary system. And that will also help with our deficit as well. So, thank you very much. Mr. Buckley, are you able, can we hear you, sir? Mr. Buckley, is your mic on, sir? I'm going to try to mute you and unmute you and see if that works. Okay, can you hear us, Alan? Alan, can you hear us? We can't hear you, sir. Anybody else hear him? Derrick, can you hear him? Can anybody hear Mr. Richard? Can anybody?
I don't hear him. And his
I don't
image
hear him.
is slipped behind my box in the corner, so I can't see him now either.
Yeah. 1 second, I think he's trying to figure it out here. Just give him a minute. He's working on it.
Could I respond to something you said?
Sure, go right ahead while we're waiting for
I
Alan.
mean, Brian, what I said, Brian. You were mentioning how you were proposing that much of the economic difficulties of people today is due to inflation. Mm-hmm. And admittedly, there has been a certain degree of inflation, although running a couple of percent at most. But really what has made most families face a situation where two breadwinners can barely cover their expenses. And the expenses in question of housing, of childcare, of education, have all been rising faster than incomes. And that is sort of the key point, that incomes for most Americans have been stagnating. And now incomes in America make up a smaller share of our national income, our national wealth, than ever in our history. And that's because starting in the late 60s, wages stagnated. Meanwhile, the economy has continued to grow. It's more than doubled in size. But none of that extra wealth has gone to wage earners. It's all migrated to the very top. And because it's migrated to the very top, we have more income inequality and wealth inequality than we've ever had since the Gilded Age, maybe 120 years ago, 130 years ago. And in connection with that, our economic growth has fallen to half of what it used to be, when most incomes kept pace with the rise in our national wealth. And that's because when you have these extreme inequalities of wealth, those who are at the very top simply cannot spend all that much of their wealth. It has to be kept in kind of speculative investments which don't get circulated in the economy. Whereas if more income is in the hands of a larger sector of the population, they're going to spend much more of their wealth, which will invigorate the economy. And that has not been happening. And, if we ask ourselves, why has income been stagnated? Well, part of it also is that the labor movement has become more and more disempowered. That's partly because of laws which make our labor laws in the United States, in a sense, more disempowered more slanted against employees than in any other developed nation. Unionization has fallen to the lowest level of any developed nation. And these things have contributed in a great degree to a lack of opportunity, leaving families in general more hard-pressed than ever to make ends meet. And it's really a political responsibility of whether we let things continue in that vein. And the solution, I don't think, lies in changing our monetary system or even deciding to issue fewer bonds and not allow our national debt to grow. It really has to do with how we treat this basic relationship of employee and employer, and to what degree we ensure that people are able to earn a decent living. That people can only need to work one job so that they can have a life with their family, a life to engage in politics as a citizen, and nonetheless make ends meet, and that when they no longer can work, they have a replacement income that is decent enough for them to make ends meet. And we're talking about something that has to come to about $20 an hour. Actually, if you took the minimum wage in 1968, which in terms of inflation was as higher than it's ever been, if you adjusted it with regard to the productivity gains and the increase of national wealth, the minimum wage would be about $22 an hour. And that's more or less what we need to think about. And that's not unrealistic, because our national income before the pandemic and the economic sort of collapse that was associated with it, we had a national income of over $18 trillion. It was getting close to 19, approaching 20. There are only about 160 million wage earners. That comes to an average income, if we really average it, to about $115,000 a year. I think 8% of Americans make six figures or more. So we definitely can raise the bottom. There's plenty of room to do so.
Thank you,
And
Richard.
that's a political decision.
Thank you, sir. Alan, can we hear you yet? Alan.
Can you hear me now with the phone?
I can hear you over the phone.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you over the phone.
I'm not talking. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So, go ahead, we'll hear you over the phone.
Whatever.
Okay, hear you and see you.
Okay, great. I wish I were better looking, but anyways, as far as student debt, I have some materials on my website. The federal government's involvement in like healthcare pushed up the price dramatically from when I was in college back in the late 70s, early 80s, when it cost $3,000 a year to go in-state, where I went to college in Ohio. So just like healthcare is a third party in the equation, it's caused the price to go up dramatically. We need to reduce that impact. I have some materials on my website, a couple of very comparable universities. One granted federal aid, the other one didn't allow it, and the difference in price was basically the federal aid amount. So there are things being done. Purdue University is offering students a deal where basically they collect it for several years after they graduate, and instead of going into debt, we need to reduce the debt. Moving on to the national debt, which a lot of you know is my passion. I think the left and the right on this call, this forum so far. The left seems to think there's no problem. The right seems to think there's major problems. I fall on the right on this side. This is an issue that I've studied for many years. It's just, the reality is, if we don't get it matters, because historically, democracies, republics collapse over these fiscal power. And here's the chart. Can you see this?
Yep,
Can everybody see that?
I can see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the debt projected debt. You can see it's much greater than any time in history, and this is much different than the past. There's mainly entitlements built into the system that need to be reduced. Now, what's going on now to confront the problem? This is another chart that shows the growth in the debt and the growth of the amount of money created to buy treasury bonds. So this will work for a while, but eventually you'll start to see the value of the dollar diminish significantly. We've already seen some reduction lately that has caused the stock market to go up. And if you follow that in the papers, basically dollars depreciated in value, and then they said exports cheaper, and that gave the stock market a boost. Well, Western European countries, the EU, are going to do the same. And this is going to be a race to the bottom because politicians of both major parties don't have the guts to tell the people that our system doesn't work on a long-term basis. But all that does is make gold worth more and silver worth more. It makes it very, very hard for unsavvy investors who are in CDs, etc., to keep up, including Treasury notes. The 10-year Treasury note is paying about 0.6 or 0.7% now. You get into 3 or 4% inflation a year, and that's going to be a big loser. And last week, the Fed announced that their new inflation goal. Not only by statute, their objectives are to do three things: produce moderate long-term interest rates, which they haven't done in many years. They don't even talk about that. Produce stable prices and low unemployment. Well, last week or a week and a half ago, they announced they were basically giving up on stable prices by saying we're going to look at averages over several years, which means they were below 2, below 1 for a number of years, the 1 and 2 range. So look for 3 to 4 is acceptable because of all this money that's being printed. As I said before, in 2007, the total debt was under $9 trillion. The GAO said our debts are going to spiral out of control. They're about $27 trillion now. I showed you that chart where it's headed. Our system absolutely will not take it financially. It will collapse. Unless they get a housing, that requires reduced spending, significantly reduced spending, balanced budgets when we're not experiencing a recession or worse. And all this is doable. And it's very different than the past. Anybody hear a beeping noise?
Yes, I got it too.
Anyone need to mute their phone?
Yeah, it was feedback. Somebody's
Okay.
phone.
It's very different from the past. It's not going to work long term. And the two major parties, their only goal is to be in power, to stay in power. All this works if the world's going to come to an end in 3 to 10 years from now. And maybe the people in D.C. know something we don't know. Maybe they know the Earth is going to be hit by a major asteroid or we're going to be invaded by Martians, and it's over with in 3 to 10 years. Then all this makes sense. It really does. But if that's not the case, then we're headed for misery. And a lot of people I talk to say, oh, I feel sorry for our children, our grandchildren. Everybody on this call, if you live a normal life expectancy, this is going to hit within the next 10 to 15 years because you just look at the chart I just showed you. It's going to be a disaster. And if it collapses, everyone is going to be miserable. And the problem we've got is we get a situation where there's a guy named Peter Daysack, got him on my website. He said, look, he's the U.S. expert on pandemics. He said, let me give you a direct quote. They asked him, are you hiding in your bunker now? I'm not holding in my bunker right now. We're going to be hit by a much bigger one sometime in the next 10 years. So after the Great Recession, we ran huge debts. Okay, and the excuse was we got to get the economy back up to snuff. Well, the pandemic is much worse financially than the Great Recession was. So we're going to hear the same thing about how we need to run huge debt to get the economy back up to where it was. The CEO said recently, a few months ago, it's going to take 10 years to get the economy back to where it was. So guess what? We run huge debts over the next 10 years. And Daysack's right. And he may or may not be right. But if he's right, we're done. We are done. Because markets are not going to allow more debt. They're not going to allow more debt at any sort of reasonable interest rate. and you get back to a more ordinary rate, and you're talking 30 to 40% of the revenue has to go to interest expense. I got another guy quoted on my website named Luther, who's an economist who works at Stanford, saying basically democracy loses its credibility when it starts spending too high of a share of its tax revenue on interest. And so that's the dilemma we're in.
Thank you, Alan.
So the ways out of it, after World War II, we got out of it through three things. Real growth of over 5% for two significant periods, 1950 to 1955, and 1961 to 1968, over 5% real growth. It's not happening with mature economies, okay? We had huge inflation. And those of you who are old enough to remember, Derrick's about my age, back in the late 70s, you just remember that from 68 to 82, we averaged 7.4% inflation per year. 7.4, okay? And the other way we got out of it at that time was we had higher taxes on the wealthy. We could tax the daylight out of the wealthy and it wouldn't solve it. The only realistic ways out of this thing now are either reorganization, like a bankruptcy type reorganization, or it's a heck of a lot of money printing. That's the reality. And the reason the U.S. stays ahead of these other countries is because we're just the least bad apple. And the Chinese want to overtake us in a number of ways, militarily.
Thank you, Alan.
And they want to have their currency be the reserve currency, so they'll have that economic power that we have. And so at some point, if we don't get our act together, someone or something is going to overtake the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Thank you, Alan.
I don't know where I'm at the time, but I think that's probably good.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, we're going to try to go to Annette Davis-Jackson. Can you hear us? Unmute yourself, Annette. Annette, are you there?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Go ahead, speak for 5 minutes on the national debt
Hello.
and the deficit. Go ahead.
Well, let me tell you, the national debt is kind of crazy because the United States is really in debt to its citizens. And the reason that it's in debt to its citizens, because in 1933, the United States went bankrupt. So when they went bankrupt, what they did is put our mortgages in place and securitize it, right? And also, our birth certificates are actually a bond. Our signatures are a bond. If you ever wonder when you go to the bank and you get a loan for a house, you wonder, how do you get it? You might put something down, but you never know if that gets to where it should be going because it goes in an escrow account, right? So the bottom line, the United States is in debt to its citizens, and they need to serve the citizens a whole lot more. Do we print money in the United States of America? Yes, we do. But the only thing to solve that is one of my tenets for the United States Senate is put the gold standard in place. Get rid of our mortgages so that it stops being securitized so that Wall Street can make money on our properties. And if you look at the Bloomberg report, you're going to see how the Standard & Poor rate mortgages. They have certain mortgages in a pool, right? It could be 500 mortgages or more. They started, triple C ratings, and after they move through these tranches, they end up being AAA ratings. It's all a scheme. So rather than talk about the national debt, we need to talk about how these agencies and Wall Street and the banks are using the citizens and using their money. Our birth certificates or a bond, we need to look into that. If you go into a site, GMEI, it's amazing how if you put in your social security number, you're going to see, and it's called GMEI utility. If you put your social security number in GMEI utility in the search engine, you're going to see so many people trading off your social security number. So there's more than meets the eye with the debt. And the bottom line, the United States debt, they're in debt to their citizens. And we got to change that around with the gold standards.
All right.
Done.
All right. Thank you, Annette.
You're welcome.
Okay, Derrick, you go ahead, sir. Unmute yourself, sir. There we go. Hear you. Go ahead.
I want to make a rebuttal to Mr. Winfield, something that he said about the Federal Reserve. I pointed out that the Federal Reserve is not a federal entity. And I'm making the rebuttal because essentially yourself and Alan concurred with my position that unless the Federal Reserve, our present monetary system, is not dealt with in terms of being met with a death blow, nothing else will matter. And Alan puts that within the next 10 years. However, I believe that when we run for office, it is our responsibility to put out correct information. And Mr. Winfield said that the Federal Reserve is a government entity. It is not. So, not my words. I'm going to read just a paragraph that explains the entity we know as the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve banks are not a part of the federal government, but they exist because of an act of Congress. And Brian, you mentioned that act, which took place in 1913. Their purpose is to serve the public, but as Alan so pointedly made note of, they don't. They serve themselves. While the Board of Governors is an independent government agency, the Federal Reserve banks are not are set up like private corporations. They are a private entity operating in their own interests, collecting interest off the backs of taxpayers for the money that our federal government borrows from them. This information is what needs to be told to people, not this illusion that because the word federal exists before Reserve Bank, giving the impression that they are somehow a federal government agency, I think is just plain wrong. We are running for office, and I believe all of us wants the best for this country. But when we put out false information, I think we do our cause collectively a disservice. So I just had to say that. I'm sorry.
Okay, Mr. Winfield, would you like to respond, sir? Unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Grayson pointed out that, there is a board of governors that are, of course, appointed by the government. They have a certain independence, however. But when you speak of it being a private entity, I mean, you really can't speak of there being any particular owners of the Federal Reserve. It's not as if, for example, when the Federal Reserve gives money to banks and sets the interest rate at which will be paid back, that those revenues go to some private body. They're going to an entity that in a way is part of our public institutions. And whenever the Fed is involved in both issuing money, giving it to banks in various ways, and having the Treasury have the funds it needs to issue bonds and the like, all of this in a way is for the sake of the finances of our government. It's not going to any other separate entity. And to the extent that the government is, ideally speaking, of and by the people, we're talking about something that really is something that should be operating on our behalf and doesn't really have a separate interest. Now, of course, it depends upon what policies it follows. Is it going to concern itself with trying to achieve full employment, or is it going to concern itself with other concerns that may be something that privilege a particular sector of the population?
All right, thank you, Richard. Alan, go ahead. You hear me? Go ahead, Alan.
You hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say that the banks too are a little bit off the Federal Reserve Bank. I would call it a quasi-governmental entity. But people need to understand that when the Fed prints money, buys treasury bonds, treasury notes, the demand for treasury notes and driving down interest rates. And it's also trying to reduce all that. Fed owns the treasury note. The interest is paid by the Treasury Department to the Fed. The Fed keeps a very small piece of it and sends it back to the member banks, and the rest of it goes back to the Treasury. So the interest expense is greatly diminished. Now, what's the downside? You got a lot more money outstanding. And that's that chart I was showing you earlier. It just shows so far this COVID period, they've been printing and buying treasuries at the same rate that they've been borrowing from the public to finance the CARES Act and all these other benefits. So, you know, you see that commercial with the easy button where the guy just presses the easy button. This is Jerome Powell pressing the easy button. It's real easy. And it works in the short term. Now, the question is, how does it impact those other dominoes down the line? And if you read some of the things Jerome Powell has said, he's basically not very concerned about that. He's just concerned about putting out the fire, which would be fine if, after this pandemic ends, the government, when I say the government, I mean the Congress and the administration, somebody needs to put their mute button on their phone. Somebody hit not in. Okay, anyways. But after the Great Recession, huge steps were run, justifying how we need to do it because the economy back to where it was. These major parties that left in power are going to do the same thing after this pandemic, which has been called much worse financially than the Great Recession. And if this day stack is right, and he's very reputable, he was on 60 Minutes a few months ago, excuse me. He's right, and he may or may not be right, obviously. But if we have huge steps going into a much bigger pandemic where everybody has to stay at home or they die, it's done. All these businesses are going to go bankrupt. It's over. It's a whole new world. And we can't go there. We just have to make sure we don't go there. And the main way to do that is to get our financial house in order right after this pandemic ends. It's not going to happen with any of the major candidates running in our race. And it's unfortunate because I want to live for today and tomorrow. I can't be slogan to say tomorrow. I really see very little thought given to what we need to do to live conservatively to preserve a potential good future for this country. So, and by the way, socialism doesn't work. Thank you.
All right. Would anybody else like to respond? Would anybody else like to respond? John, you want to jump in?
Sure. I want to share with you on this article written by two professors of Fortuin, who's an author on modern monetary theory, and L. Randall Ray, who's also a professor of economics. These professors have written this article here in The Guardian. The coronavirus has destroyed the myth of a deficit. And while I'm not 100% an MMT fan, this article is essential reading. The one thing that I do think they're not really addressing in this article, and they address, I'd say 95% of the economic issues that are on the horizon, they don't address the unnecessary burden put on by the Federal Reserve to issue money through this quasi-public-private system that was schemed up in 1913, and which we had more than 100 years of activism against creating a central bank of the type of the Federal Reserve. There was the progressive movement that was gaining a lot of force, especially in rural areas, as people educated themselves on the danger of central banks. And that movement was co-opted by a Wall Street insider who worked his way into the Progressive Party and destroyed it from within. And nonetheless, really, the subtitle of this article, no federal government spending doesn't have to be paid for. The crisis showed that providing for our society is not a financial issue. Really, the CARES Act has shown that they've potentially allocated $4.5 trillion in that act. And actually, since all of you, I presume, understand what divide by zero means, that you end up with infinity, the CARES Act essentially allows for infinite funds to go to the sectors stated in that act, and even those guidelines have been completely abused. We do need massive government intervention to prevent ordinary business owners and average employees from going homeless in the next few months. We need to follow a Danish model or implement UBI because we don't know when we can get this coronavirus under control. I've previously stated how New Zealand has effectively put the kibosh on the virus, that they are being extremely concerned about less than 100 cases
Thank you, John.
concerned need contact tracing, which is such a necessary part of keeping pandemics under control. It may be nearly impossible at this point in this country because of the widespread nature of the virus.
Thank you, John.
So, okay, read the article. Coronavirus has destroyed the myth of the deficit. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to call on Alan Buckley. He has his hand up. He'd like to speak. Go ahead, Alan.
Let me just say this. I don't have the article with me, but if you Google economists' opinions on MMT, there's an article that I pulled, and they went through all of the reputable economists at all the major universities, the University of Chicago, Ivy League schools. Almost every single one of them said it's a bunch of crap. Every single one of them, except there's a handful of people out there like these two that you point out, John. And there's that quack up at State University of New York, Stony Brook, the woman who's behind the whole thing. It's just, that's insanity. We're just going to print as much money as we want until it creates inflation. Well, it's going to create inflation. you double or triple the amount of money outstanding, every dollar is worth that much less. It's just logical. So again, I don't have the article handy, but again, these are all big name economists who say it's a bunch of fun.
And
Anybody else like to speak?
I'd like to respond by saying I am in agreement. There must be, but it doesn't be the Federal Reserve. And this article articulates that, in particular, the CARES Act shows that we are actually following the MMT model. That is what's been going on for decades. And all this harping about the deficit that we hear from Republicans, well, if they really cared about the deficit, they wouldn't have been cutting taxes on the rich and running up the deficit whenever they took control of the executive branch. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else like to respond about anything?
Can I just make two brief points?
Go ahead, Rick, Mr. Winfield.
One has to do with increasing the money supply. You know, it used to mean printing money. Now it's a matter of pressing a button on a computer. You know, increasing the money supply will not cause inflation if one uses that money to increase the production of goods and services, because then goods and services can keep pace with money, and money will not necessarily lose any value. The same thing in a way applies to the national debt. You know, what matters is whether an increase of the national debt is going to be serving a productive purpose, which will increase the wealth of the nation, or equally put off a disaster, which will involve vast destructions of wealth. One such disaster is the climate crisis we're facing. There would be nothing wrong in engaged in deficit spending to make the kind of public investments in green energy and the like that can prevent economic damages that will be done. When ocean levels rise 24 feet, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, or the increase of heat, it will make 19% of the Earth's surface uninhabitable, as opposed to 1% now, right? There are ways in which public spending that can involve deficit spending is going to be vastly productive, where by contrast, one can be a deficit hawk and pull in the reins and act as an espouser of austerity that can lead to real disasters and really not preserve the future for our children, but the exact opposite. Make that future unlivable.
Real quick, you know, we had balanced budget in terms of tax.
Go ahead, Alan.
For 3 years, we had great process. The more you can do through the private sector and the less you do through the public sector, the better off we're all going to be. The public sector is much less efficient. I have to deal with the government regularly. I see it over and over again. And it's just logical. If you create a lot more money, not a little bit more, but a lot more, you're going to see inflation, because every dollar is going to be worth less. So unless you have deflationary forces working that can overcompensate or at least equally compensate for the inflationary forces, you're going to get inflation. And there are deflationary forces that work, particularly now. And I am not saying we shouldn't be running a significant deficit this year. We should be, and that's fine. The problem is 2 years from now, when the economy is doing great, which we all hope it will be, they'll still be running huge deficits. And then if Dave Sack's right, which he may or may not be right, so it's done. It's going to be too far off the map, and no one's going to loan unless they can put significant stirrups and reins on the Federal Reserve, which would be fine with me, to be honest with you. To say they're going to cut back the money printing, and also you're going to have to pay a higher interest rate. Well, we went to more traditional 5% Treasury note rate we had historically going back to the 1830s. We have about 21 trillion of public debt right now. You multiply that out, 5% of 21 trillion, you're talking about 1 to 1.2 trillion of interest. We're going to have 3 to 3.5 trillion in revenue this year. 33% of the revenue would need to go to interest. And again, who-third. You spend too much of your tax revenue on interest, and the government loses credibility. So that's the reality. This is different than in the past. It's different than any time in the past, because these entitlements are just scheduled to grow unless they're cut. And I propose reasonable reductions to them, and a simpler tax system that forces balanced budgets using algebra. I don't want to take any more time, thanks.
All right, thank you, Alan. I just want to address this a little bit. You guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, Alan, you talked about the interest and how that is going to take up. You hear it, Coy? Getting a little background noise. Okay, you hear me okay? You hear me?
Brian, we hear you perfectly clear.
Okay.
You're good.
Just want to make sure that we're not getting that background. Okay, so all the interest that's going to be paid on this debt that's being put out by the Federal Reserve right now, too much of it's going to go towards of the government spending is going to go towards that, and that's going to, like Alan said, the government loses instant credibility. That's why we need to get away from the Federal Reserve and actually get back to stop putting this debt constantly, because every time the Federal Reserve puts out money, it puts it out as a debt, and that debt never gets extinguished. Again, it never gets extinguished unless somebody goes bankrupt or it's brought back. Well, the Federal Reserve wants to get their money back, so it's not. So someone has to go bankrupt, and that's why you have all these bankruptcies. That's why you have all these bubbles. The only way to fix that is get away from a fiat money system and get back to a wealth-based system, which increases the standard of living for everyone. And by doing a wealth-based system that everybody benefits from, we will increase the growth of this country like we've never seen before, without inflation, because you're not putting the money in as a debt, and the dollars are not being worth less and less and less. Since 1913, our dollar is basically 3%. It buys 3% of what it did in 1913, and that's just wrong. So we need to get back to a better base system. We need to start being straightforward with the American people here in Georgia and all across America. If we can start doing that, we can start actually solving the problem. Right now, the politicians don't want to do that. And obviously, the $1 million candidates don't want to come on this program because they'd actually have to answer a question, and that would be tough. So, anybody else would like to comment? Go ahead. Raise your hand. John, go ahead.
You know what? Oh, God. Okay.
Yes, well, in the Constitution, Congress has the authority for the creation of money, and it handed off that responsibility in 1913 to the Federal Reserve. However, it still does have the power to coin money under the Constitution. Thus, we can implement greenbacks as was done during the Civil War, with Congress issuing money to pay for the crucial needs, like payments to families so they don't go homeless during this crisis of COVID-19, payments to pay for the Green New Deal to prevent places that I lived in, like Miami. Well, Miami might not be savable, and parts of New York City and many coastal regions might not be savable. But we have to try. We have to do everything we can. And we've shown, even after we stupidly created the quasi-public Federal Reserve, we showed in the past that we can set our national priorities like FDR did, and with his New Deal programs, which did help Americans through the Depression, though it was very much skewed towards white people, unjustly. And then when this specter of fascism across the globe layered on top of the disaster of the Depression, we were able to gear up our economy for World War II. And we won that war, and we need to treat not only COVID, but the climate crisis as the same disaster that Nazism and fascism was to the world.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go next to Mr. Winfield had his hand up, and then we're going to go to Annette Davis-Jackson, and then to Mr. Grayson. So, Mr. Winfield, you're up, sir. 2 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to say something about our student debt crisis, which affects 44 million people who are drowning under a debt of $1.4 trillion, the second largest type of debt in this country. This is something that's really part of that ugly side of American exceptionalism, because you don't have a student debt problem in any other affluent nation, in fact, in any nation, because other nations made the political decision to make higher education accessible to people no matter how much money they had. They made the same decision regarding higher education we made toward public education. And it's worth remembering that the decision to have public education be funded by public taxation was something that occurred for the first time in the South after the newly freed slaves demanded that there be public education to which they could have access. Because remember, our Constitution does not provide any right to be educated, let alone any right to have a job or to have housing or any of our other social rights. But we can make a political decision to eliminate the problem of student debt for anyone in the future by doing what has been done in all of Europe, providing tuition-free public higher education with stipends so people can afford to go as a full-time student. And keep in mind that a good part of the student debt is held by banks that were bailed out in 2008 at tremendous taxpayer expense. They can handle writing off these debts. And our federal government can. There's been an economic study which says that if we cancel student debt, then the people, the 44 million individuals who would be freed of that burden, would be able to do things like have the money to save up for a house, to have children, to do all sorts of things. It is estimated to increase our GDP by over $100 billion a year and potentially provide 1.5 million new jobs. So I think actually the idea of canceling student debt and making a public commitment to provide free access to higher education is the decision that's enabling and one that enhances our prosperity and our opportunity.
Thank you.
On all sides.
Thank you. Okay. Annette Davis-Jackson, can you unmute yourself? Would you like to speak on this? Annette?
Yes, can you roll back the question, please?
Basically, we're just talking about our national debt, the national deficit, and anything you want to add about the student debt that we have in this country, what you would do about it, and how you agree or disagree with what's been said. Go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Well, great. Okay, great. He took longer than 2 minutes, but I love him. As far as the student debt, I did a United States Department of Education hearing regarding the student debt. You'll see it on file. And I believe that any student who has a student loan ought to be coupled with a corporation, so that corporation, they can work with that corporation during the time that they're in college, so that corporation can pay off their student loans. There's so many ways that we can eliminate that debt, because you have to realize that the corporations are a part of the corporate welfare, which we don't talk about. Their corporate welfare ought to account for the student loan debt. And I believe that we can do that so very easily. And I will say this, you know, a lot of people want to complain about what's going on in America, whether it be healthcare, whether it be Medicare, you know, whether it be community, neighborhoods, whether it be the deficit. But there are many of us as Americans that could sit down at the table, develop a think tank, and Washington, D.C. has a lot of think tanks, and develop a blueprint. I am all out for developing a blueprint that works. We have too many businessmen and experts in our field not to make America work. And to me, it is utterly a shame that we can't even sit down at the table long enough, not even Congress, to sit down at the table long enough to find out what works. Because we have to remember that all the money, everything Congress does, it belongs to the people. So if they remember that, and I'm so glad that all of us are running, so we have to stick it to America in our sound bites that it is our money. How are we spending our money? And I declare and decree that we have to do an audit of the United States of America to find out so that the Congress fully knows whose money is it. That is a wonderful thing. When I helped uncover the corruption in the DeKalb County school system, that was one of the things, to do a forensic audit and a financial audit. I am asking for a forensic audit, which is the internal infrastructure, which Donald J. Trump is doing now, and a forensic audit to find out what is the state of our affairs. I believe that once we do that, the people will be able to understand, hey, let me get in the game, let me bring my expertise, and let's keep our money within and use it wisely. And as far as education, for education money, everybody, you know, who goes from elementary, middle, and high school, they have an FTE number, which comes from the federal government. And the federal government also gives the state money, but then also some of the fees from the schools come from property taxes, right? So we need to know how that money is spent, because a lot of the money is not spent toward the gift of a student. Every student has a gift. I don't care if they're in special education, but they have a gift. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Mr. Grayson, you're up, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
2 minutes, sir.
As I said earlier, you know, what was done to our students is a travesty. And the private banking system is not a friend of the government. This is the reason why George Washington warned us against them. This is the reason why Andrew Jackson warned us against the private banking system. If you study history like I do, we see what happened with Napoleon when he went to a private banking system, asking them for money to defeat his enemies, then refused to pay them back, so they simply funded his enemies and he was soundly defeated. Our children are defeated before they even get out of school. So I would never condone wiping out student loan debt because you give those students a free pass, even though I know they got a bad year. What are you going to do next? Tack it on my back? I don't know how many times I have to say, the government has no money of its own. Whatever they get, they either borrow from the private banking system or they take it from us. So shuffling that debt off to someone else is not the answer. So what I just heard Ms. Jackson say about corporations, et cetera, I think ways that are creative will work better in solving the issues with the students, like eliminating the interest, because we know they got a raw deal. And as Ms. Jackson suggested, partnering with corporations. Then there is the option of military service. For every year you serve in the military, we'll reduce your student loan debt by $10,000. But there are other ways of addressing this issue without thinking that it is okay, just, and fair to wipe out their student loan debt and throw it on the backs of all other people. And this thing about everyone is entitled to a higher learning education is nonsense. Everyone is not college material. When I was in high school, I graduated the year before Jimmy Carter screwed it all up. I graduated in the year where we still had technical training in schools. We had auto mechanics, we had heating and air conditioning, we had metalworking, we had all manner of options that were available to students. Removed whatever 4 R's, I think that's what they used to call it. So everybody's not going to go to college. So find alternative paths for them. I'm a network engineer, been doing it for 30 years. You know what? I didn't need to spend $30,000 on education to learn to do what I do. But that was a different time. People like to see that you had it in you to go to college, to spend the 4 years, to get that Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor's of Arts or whatever degree it was that you were going to get. It says something about the individual. But you know what? We need to be talking more about people's future, and we need to get focused on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at the high school level. So, like when I was in school, a guy could walk out and go work at GM as a mechanic, or go and work for Roto-Rooter as a plumber, or some other entity fixing air conditioners or whatnot. Let people walk right out of school and go to coding, which is something I did for years, or network engineering, which is something that I'm engaged in now. Doesn't necessarily require a college education.
Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you.
Can I just respond briefly to that?
Yeah, let's try to keep it down a little bit. We're to 2 minutes. I'm giving you guys a little extra here, but let's try to keep it to 2 minutes so we get everybody in. I think after this we're going to do a 1 minute closing by everybody. Go ahead, Richard.
If we make a commitment to provide anyone who is able to qualify to go to college and wants to go to college, to enable them to do so, where how much money they have is not going to be an obstacle. But the same thing can also be given, as they do in Europe, to people who are not going to college but want on-the-job training, want apprenticeships, want to get some technical study so that they can get a certain kind of occupation. That is also offered to people without having to pay any tuition, and you get a stipend to be able to handle it. That way, all doors are left open to everyone. And how much wealth you have does not condemn you to an absence of opportunity. And that's what we should aspire to. Doesn't mean saying everyone goes to college.
I agree.
Everyone who can and wants to should have that opportunity. Everyone who wants to get technical training, non-college training, a non-college occupation should have that option too. And we've got to provide the assistance to enable that.
I agree with equal opportunity and access for everyone. I do not agree with making other people pay for it.
All right, thank you. All right, now we're gonna everybody's gonna just take a minute. I'm gonna try to keep us basically a minute, a closing statement for a minute, because we're having technical difficulties all night here for some reason with the video as well. So I apologize for that. There must be a storm nearby or something. Anyway, let's go in reverse alphabetical order. Mr. Winfield, 1 minute.
Okay.
Why vote for you? Go ahead, sir.
I just want to deal with the issue that was just brought up about not wanting to have other people pay for the opportunities of some. And I think we should realize that, when we're trying to provide people with what they need to exercise their freedom, if we're going to use taxation to support it, we should aspire to follow the principles of fair taxation. And fair taxation involves that we're going to tax in a way that's going to be something that enables people to be as free as possible. That means we're going to put the tax burden on those people whose opportunities will be least constricted by the payments they're called upon to make. That means we put the burden of taxation on those who can most easily pay and on whose level of living and so forth will hardly be impacted by having to pay a share. And after all, none of us are able to produce what wealth we're involved in all on our own. We're part of a market, we're part of a society. We all depend upon one another's labors. We don't have to be afraid of that, and we should not be afraid to have fair taxation.
Thank you, Mr. Winfield. All right, I'll go next. 1 minute. My name is Brian Slowinski. We've been talking about the national debt, student debt, and the deficit. We need a candidate, a senator who has the gravitas in order to address the issues that are in front of us and to be fiscally straight with the American people, with the citizens of Georgia. We're not getting that with our current crop of candidates, our $1 million candidates, because they're just basically relying on focus groups in the 30-second commercial. I've been endorsed by the Libertarian Party. I've been endorsed by the Constitution Party. I've been recommended by them as well. I am the consensus good choice to the lesser of two evils coming up in November, and I appreciate your support. Go to voteslowinski.com to look about for more information. Thank you. Next we will have, let's see, who the next in order will be Annette Davis Jackson. You hear me okay? Go ahead, Annette. You got a minute to go. You go? Annette? Can you unmute yourself? Annette. Okay, seeing no Annette. Mr. Grayson, you're next, sir. Mr. Grayson, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay.
Ms. Jackson, I want to tell you what I love Georgia. I love this agricultural state. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Got a minute.
Yes. Yes. This is Annette Davis Jackson. I want to tell you that I love this agricultural state. That's why I'm running for the United States Senate. Right now, I am out in the streets, and I tell you, there are some wonderful people that can yield to solutions for America. Our children deserve our efficacy. Our seniors deserve our efficacy. Our middle class deserves our efficacy. And the reason that we run is to make sure that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, that the government spends our money the way that we like in our communities. We need the gold standard. We need to put it in place for our mortgages. We need to make sure that our youth are taken care of so that they can build the nation that our founding fathers left us. My name is Annette Davis Jackson, and I tell you, I love Georgia. Peanuts, pecans, peaches, and everything that Georgia has. We're number one in business. And let's
Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Annette. Okay, Mr. Grayson, you're up, sir.
Oh, are you going to have something else? Hey,
Thank you, Annette. Go ahead, Mr. Grayson.
My name is Derrick Grayson. You can find me at graysonforgeorgia.com. I believe that all of our problems starts with government, and that it is the responsibility of the people to solve those problems by electing politicians who first understand that they are not your leader, but that they are there to serve their constituency. And the way that they can most honorably serve their constituency is to obey the Constitution. And when I say obey the Constitution, I mean 100% of the Constitution, 100% of the time. If there are defects in the Constitution, the founding fathers built in a remedy for that. Follow that path. But nothing else matters if a politician is not willing to serve his constituency. I'm the guy that is promising to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Okay, Mr. Fortuin, you go ahead, sir. 1 minute.
Great. Hi, my name's John Fortuin, and we need in this pandemic time to implement a new version of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal to put money into the pocketbooks of ordinary Americans who don't have paychecks due to this greater depression that we're living through. But we have to remember that back in FDR's time, the wealthy elites of that era despised FDR's policies with an ideological zeal and planned for opportunities to reverse them all. They went as far as planning a military coup against the Roosevelt administration, which was thwarted by the loyalty of General Smedley Buckley, who had been approached in leading this coup effort. But as the Green Party candidates, we are going to focus on bringing a Green New Deal to reverse this greater depression and solve climate change.
Thank you, John. Okay, Mr. Buckley, are you available, sir?
Yeah, thank you.
We need your picture.
With any major party candidate.
Put your camera on, Alan.
What?
Your camera?
Can you hear me?
Can hear you. We need your camera to see you.
I see.
Okay. We need to reduce our healthcare costs to the market-based forces. We need a much simpler tax system. We need to reform entitlements and reasonably reduce them. We need to reduce our foreign intervention. We have 800 foreign military bases, and the rest of the world combined has approximately 60. On my website, I propose solutions to all these incredibly complicated problems. It's taken me 17 years to put together those solutions. I would challenge anybody to come up with something better than what I've come up with. I would appreciate your vote. And the website is buckleyforsenate.org. There's the traditional yard sign. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Again, I want to thank everybody that participated tonight. I want to go right down the line that I have you. Mr. Alan Buckley, Independent. We have John Fortune from the Green Party. We have Derrick Grayson from the Republican Party. We have Annette Davis Jackson from the Republican Party. Myself, Brian Slowinski from the Libertarian Party, as well as the Constitution Party. And Richard Dean Winfield from the Democratic Party. I want to thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing you next Monday at 7 o'clock. Tell all your friends. Hopefully we won't have any more technical difficulties like we had this evening. Again, I want to thank you for participating. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you. Don't worry, that's everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you.